The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as Kate Middleton adjusted her navy blue coat one final time. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the October chill, but from the weight of what lay ahead. The most significant moments in her journey as the Princess of Wales, though she had no idea just how profound it would become. The sleek black car wound through the streets of London, carrying Kate toward a meeting that had been months in the planning. Inside the vehicle, she reviewed her notes one last time, her mind racing through the carefully choreographed schedule ahead. The royal protocol team had briefed her extensively, but nothing could truly prepare her for what was about to unfold. Kate had always understood the responsibility that came with her title, but lately, that weight felt heavier than ever. The public watched her every move, analyzed her every gesture, and held her to impossible standards. Yet today felt different. Today, she carried the hopes and dreams of countless people who needed their voices heard, their struggles acknowledged. The destination was a community center in East London, where she would meet with families affected by a recent tragedy that had shaken the entire nation. A fire in a residential building had claimed 17 lives, including 5 children. The survivors were left with nothing but grief and the clothes on their backs. Kate had insisted on meeting them personally, despite warnings that such emotional encounters could be overwhelming. As the car pulled up to the modest building, Kate could see crowds gathered behind police barriers. Reporters jostled for position, their cameras ready to capture every moment. But her attention was drawn to the quieter group standing near the entrance, families clutching each other, their faces etched with loss and pain that no words could adequately describe. Kate stepped out of the car, her expression immediately softening as she took in the scene. The formal protocol seemed to melt away as she approached the first family. Maria Santos, a woman in her 40s, stood with her 2 young children. They had lost their father in the fire, and Maria's eyes held a grief so deep it seemed to echo in the silence around them. The planned formalities felt suddenly inappropriate. Kate had memorized the proper greetings, the careful phrases designed to show sympathy without overstepping boundaries. But as she looked into Maria's eyes, all of that fell away. Instead, she simply reached out and took the woman's hands in her own. "I'm so sorry," Kate whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmur of the crowd. Those 3 simple words carried more weight than any prepared statement could have managed. Maria's composure crumbled, and tears began flowing freely down her cheeks. What happened next would be remembered by everyone present. Instead of maintaining the careful distance that royal protocol typically required, Kate pulled Maria into a gentle embrace. The cameras clicked frantically, but Kate seemed oblivious to them all. In that moment, she was simply one human being comforting another in their darkest hour. The ripple effect was immediate. Other family members, who had been standing rigid with nervous anticipation, began to relax. Children who had been hiding behind their parents started to emerge. The atmosphere shifted from formal ceremony to something far more genuine and healing. Kate spent the next hour moving through the group, but not in the structured way her schedule had outlined. Instead, she followed her instincts, drawn to wherever she felt she was needed most. She knelt down to speak with an 8-year-old boy who had lost his grandmother. She listened intently as a teenager shared his fears about his family's uncertain future. She held the hand of an elderly man who had saved 3 neighbors, but couldn't stop blaming himself for those he couldn't reach. With each interaction, Kate's carefully constructed royal facade continued to dissolve. Her voice grew softer, her gestures more natural. The prepared talking points were forgotten in favor of genuine conversations about loss, hope, and the long road to healing that lay ahead. The community center's main hall had been set up for a formal presentation about the relief efforts underway. Local officials were prepared to give Kate a briefing on housing arrangements, financial assistance, and counseling services. But as the group moved inside, it became clear that Kate had other priorities. Instead of taking her designated seat at the head table, she chose to sit in a circle with the families on simple plastic chairs. The officials looked uncertain, glancing at their prepared materials and wondering how to proceed. Kate noticed their confusion and offered a small smile that seemed to say everything would be fine, even if it wasn't following the script. "Me about your loved ones," she said simply, addressing the group. "I want to know who they were. What made them special?" It was a request that no one had expected, but it opened floodgates of memories and stories that had been waiting to be shared one by one. Family members began to speak. They talked about a grandfather who grew the most beautiful roses in his window box. They remembered a young mother who sang lullabies in 3 different languages. They shared stories of a teenage brother who dreamed of becoming a doctor, and an aunt who made the neighborhood's best curry. Kate listened to every word, her attention never wavering. She laughed when they shared funny memories and wiped away tears when the pain became too much to bear. The formal schedule was completely abandoned, but no one seemed to mind. Something more important was happening here as the stories continued. Kate began to understand the true scope of what had been lost. These weren't just statistics or names on a list. They were beloved family members, friends, neighbors, who had made their community richer and more vibrant. Their absence left holes that could never be filled, only learned to live with. The afternoon wore on, and Kate's staff began to make subtle signals about her next appointment. But she seemed determined to give these families as much time as they needed. This wasn't about fulfilling a royal duty anymore. This was about honoring the memory of those who had died and supporting those left. Behind as the sun began to set outside the community center windows, Kate realized that this day had changed something fundamental within her. The careful boundaries between her public role and her private emotions had dissolved completely. She had entered this building as the Princess of Wales, following protocol and representing the monarchy. But somewhere in the midst of all those embraces and shared tears, she had discovered something deeper about what it truly meant to serve others. The weeks following Kate's visit to the community center brought unexpected changes to her daily routine. Letters began arriving at Kensington Palace in unprecedented numbers, not just from the families she had met, but from people across the country who had heard about her genuine compassion that day. The images of her embracing grieving mothers had touched something deep in the public consciousness. Kate found herself reading these letters late into the night, long after her official duties were complete. Each one told a story of loss, struggle, or hope that resonated with what she had experienced in that East London community center. Maria Santos had written several times, describing how Kate's presence had given her strength to face each new day without her husband. The 8-year-old boy had drawn her a picture of his grandmother's garden, complete with the butterflies she had loved to watch from her window. But it wasn't just the families from the fire who were reaching out. Parents who had lost children wrote about feeling seen and understood. Veterans struggling with trauma shared how Kate's willingness to truly listen had inspired them to seek help. Teachers in underfunded schools described how her authentic approach gave them hope that someone in power actually cared about their challenges. William noticed the change in his wife immediately. She had always been dedicated to her royal duties, but now there was an intensity that hadn't been there before. She would spend hours researching the issues behind each letter, trying to understand not just the individual stories, but the larger problems they represented. The formal distance that royal training had taught her to maintain seemed to have vanished completely. "You can't save everyone," William said gently one evening, as he found Kate surrounded by letters and research papers in their private study. She looked up at him with eyes that held both determination and exhaustion. "I know I can't save everyone," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "But maybe I can help more people feel less alone." It was a simple statement, but it revealed the profound shift that was taking place in how she understood her role. The palace staff began to notice changes as well. Kate's schedule requests became more specific and personal. Instead of asking for general briefings about charitable organizations, she wanted to meet with individuals who had direct experience with the issues at hand. She insisted on smaller, more intimate gatherings rather than large formal events where meaningful connections were nearly impossible. Her next major engagement was scheduled to be a visit to a children's hospital, something that had been planned months in advance. Traditionally, such visits followed a predictable pattern: arrival, brief tour, photo opportunities with smiling children, and departure. But Kate had different ideas. She arrived at the hospital earlier than scheduled, asking to spend time with the night shift nurses who rarely received recognition for their work. She sat with them in the break room, listening as they described the challenges of caring for seriously ill children while trying to support families facing unimaginable stress. When she finally began the official tour, Kate's approach was completely different from what anyone expected. Instead of moving quickly through the wards with a large entourage, she asked for just one staff member to accompany her. She wanted to spend real time with the children and their families, not just pose for photographs on the pediatric cancer ward. Kate met 7-year-old Emma, whose bright smile contrasted sharply with the medical equipment surrounding her bed. Emma's mother, Sarah, looked exhausted from weeks of sleeping in hospital chairs and watching her daughter endure treatment after treatment. Kate pulled up a chair next to Emma's bed and asked about the drawings covering the walls. Emma's eyes lit up as she explained each colorful creation, describing the adventures of the princesses and dragons she had imagined during her long hospital stays. But it was when Emma's energy flagged and she curled up against her mother that Kate saw the real story. Sarah's composure began to crack as she described the overwhelming fear that consumed her every day. The medical bills, the time away from work, the constant worry about whether they were making the right treatment decisions, it all came pouring out as Kate listened intently. "I feel like I'm failing her," Sarah whispered, glancing at Emma, who had dozed off against her shoulder. "Everyone tells me to stay positive, to be strong, but some days I just want to scream." Kate reached over and gently squeezed Sarah's hand. "You're not failing her," she said quietly. "You're loving her through the hardest thing anyone should ever have to face. That's not failure, that's heroism." The simple validation seemed to unlock something in Sarah, and she began sharing details about their journey that she had never spoken aloud before. Kate listened to every word, asking thoughtful questions and offering the kind of presence that Sarah desperately needed but rarely received as they talked. Other parents in the ward began to approach. Word had spread that the Princess of Wales was spending real time with families, not just making a ceremonial appearance, and the tiny victories that kept them going. The hospital. Staff watched in amazement as Kate facilitated conversations between families who had been suffering in isolation just feet away from each other. She introduced parents dealing with similar diagnoses, connected mothers who both struggled with medical terminology, helped create a network of support that would continue long after her visit ended. Dr. Martinez, the head of pediatric oncology, had been working at the hospital for over 20 years. He had hosted numerous royal visits and celebrity appearances, but he had never witnessed anything like what was happening in his ward that day. "She's not just visiting," he murmured to his colleague. "She's creating community." It was an observation that would prove more prescient than he realized. Kate's visit, originally scheduled for 2 hours, stretched into the entire afternoon. Her security team grew increasingly nervous about the disruption to her schedule, but Kate seemed completely absorbed in the conversations happening around her. She was learning about the hidden networks of support that families created, the small acts of kindness that made impossible situations bearable, and the strength that emerged when people felt truly seen and heard. When she finally prepared to leave, the atmosphere in the pediatric ward had been transformed. Parents who had arrived that morning feeling isolated and overwhelmed were exchanging contact information and making plans to support each other. Children who had been withdrawn were laughing and playing together. It's the healing that was taking. The place went far beyond medical treatment. As Kate walked through the hospital corridors toward the exit, she was followed by a growing crowd of staff members who wanted to thank her. But their gratitude wasn't for the publicity or funding that royal visits typically brought. They were thanking her for showing them a different way to serve, a more connected and authentic approach to helping others heal. Emma's mother, Sarah, caught up with Kate just before she reached the door. "Thank you," she said simply. "Not for visiting, for staying, for really being here with us." Kate's eyes filled with tears as she realized that Sarah had just articulated something she was only beginning to understand about her own transformation. The transformation in Kate's approach to her royal duties was becoming impossible to ignore. Media coverage began to shift from focusing on her fashion choices to highlighting the genuine connections she was making with people across the country. Social media buzzed with videos of her lengthy conversations with ordinary citizens, her willingness to listen without judgment, and her ability to make everyone feel heard and valued. But with this new approach came unexpected challenges. The rigid structure of royal protocol wasn't designed to accommodate the kind of authentic, time-intensive engagement that Kate now insisted upon. Palace schedulers found themselves constantly reworking timelines as Kate refused to rush through meaningful conversations. Security teams struggled to adapt to her spontaneous interactions with members of the public. The pressure was particularly intense from senior palace officials who worried that Kate's emotional openness might be seen as unprofessional or unstable. During a tense meeting in the palace's oak-paneled conference room, several advisors expressed concerns about maintaining appropriate boundaries. "Your Royal Highness," began Lord Chamberlain's deputy, his voice carefully measured, "while your compassion is admirable, we must consider the long-term implications of such intensive emotional engagement. The monarchy depends on a certain level of dignified distance." Kate listened patiently to their concerns, but her response surprised everyone in the room. "The monarchy also depends on the trust and love of the people we serve," she said quietly. "How can we earn that if we're not willing to truly know them?" Her question hung in the air, challenging decades of established protocol. The room fell silent as the implications of her words sank in. Kate wasn't just changing her own approach. She was questioning the fundamental assumptions about how royalty should function in the modern world. Despite the internal resistance, Kate continued to follow her instincts. Her next major engagement was a visit to a refugee resettlement center, where she would meet families who had fled conflict and were trying to rebuild their lives in a foreign country. The official program included tours of educational facilities and meetings with local officials. But Kate had already decided to focus her attention elsewhere. She arrived at the center early in the morning, for most of the planned activities were scheduled to begin. She wanted to see the place as it really was, not as it appeared during carefully orchestrated visits. What she found was a community of remarkable resilience, but also profound isolation and struggle, in a small classroom converted into temporary living space. She met Amira, a former teacher from Syria who now shared a single room with her 3 children. Amira's English was limited, but her eyes conveyed years of loss and displacement. Through a translator, she began to share her story. Amira had been a respected educator in Damascus, running a school for refugee children even as conflict raged around them. She had finally fled when the school was bombed, carrying nothing but her children and the clothes they wore. Now, months later, she felt lost and purposeless in a country where her qualifications weren't recognized and her language skills limited her options. Kate listened intently as Amira described the complex grief of losing not just her home, but her identity and sense of purpose. The translator struggled to convey the emotional weight of Amira's words, but Kate seemed to understand on a level that transcended language barriers. "Tell her I would like to learn about her work," Kate said. To the translator, "Ask her to show me how she taught her students." What happened next was unexpected and beautiful. Amira's face lit up for the first time since Kate had arrived. She began to gather materials from around the room, scraps of paper, broken crayons, a few children's books in Arabic. Within minutes, she had transformed a corner of the cramped space into an impromptu classroom. Amira began to demonstrate her teaching methods, showing Kate how she had made learning engaging and joyful even in the midst of war. She drew pictures to illustrate stories, used hand gestures to teach language concepts, and created games that helped children process their experiences through play. Kate found herself completely absorbed in the lesson, asking questions through the translator and even attempting to repeat some Arabic phrases. Other residents of the center began to gather, drawn by the sound of laughter and animated conversation. Children who had been shy and withdrawn started to emerge from their hiding places. Soon, the small room was filled with an impromptu cultural exchange. Amira was teaching Kate and several other refugees about Syrian traditions, while Kate shared stories about British customs. The barriers of language and culture began to dissolve as people found ways to communicate through gestures. drawings, and shared laughter. The center's director, who had been frantically trying to locate Kate for the scheduled tour, finally found her sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by children and completely absorbed in a counting game that Amira had created.
Oh.
The sight was so unexpected and joyful that he hesitated to interrupt. Kate spent hours in that converted classroom, but the time felt like it passed in minutes. She watched Amira's confidence grow as she shared her expertise, saw children become animated and playful for the first time in months, and witnessed the profound healing that occurred when people felt valued for who they truly were. When the official tours finally began, Kate insisted that Amira accompanied them as an equal participant rather than just a resident being showcased. She asked Amira to explain the educational needs she observed among the children, and listened carefully as those insights were translated. Kate's questions to the center officials became more pointed and specific, informed by what she had learned. During her morning with the family's DOT, the impact of Kate's approach rippled through the entire center. Staff members began to see their residents differently, recognizing the wealth of knowledge and experience that existed within their community. Plans were immediately put in motion to utilize Amira's teaching skills, and other residents began to share their own professional backgrounds and abilities. But perhaps the most significant change was in Kate herself. As she prepared to leave the center that afternoon, she realized that each authentic interaction was teaching her something new about the role she was meant to play. The formal requirements of royal duty were beginning to feel less important than the human connections that gave those duties real meaning. Amira approached Kate before her departure, carrying a small piece of paper covered in Arabic script. The translator, she explained that it was a traditional blessing that teachers gave to students who showed exceptional promise. Kate accepted the paper with tears in her eyes, understanding that she had just received one of the greatest honors of her life. As Kate's car pulled away from the refugee center, she reflected on how dramatically her understanding of service had evolved. The scheduled activities and formal presentations seemed increasingly hollow compared to the genuine exchanges she was having with people whose stories had been waiting to be heard. That evening, Kate called William to share what she had experienced. "I think I'm beginning to understand what we're really meant to do," she said. "It's not about being seen or admired. It's about seeing others and helping them feel that their lives matter." William listened as Kate described her day, hearing the passion and purpose in her voice that had been growing stronger with each authentic encounter. He was beginning to realize that his wife wasn't just changing her approach to royal duties. She was discovering a calling that would reshape their entire understanding of what it meant to serve. The news came on a gray Tuesday morning in November, delivered through a phone call that would change everything. Kate was reviewing correspondence from families she had met during recent visits when her private secretary knocked urgently on her study door. Queen wished to see her immediately at Buckingham Palace. Kate's heart raced as she made the familiar journey across London, her mind cycling through possibilities. Such urgent summons were rare and usually indicated either a crisis in the royal family or a significant shift in protocol. She had no way of knowing that this meeting would present her with the most challenging test of her newfound approach to royal service. The Queen received Kate in her private sitting room, space typically reserved for family conversations rather than official business. Her Majesty's expression was grave as she gestured for Kate to take a seat across from her. "Catherine," the Queen began, using Kate's formal name as she always did, "I need to discuss your recent activities with you. There have been observations about your methods that require immediate attention." Kate's stomach dropped, but she maintained her composure as the Queen continued. Several senior courtiers had expressed concerns about Kate's unconventional approach to royal duties. Complaints had been filed about disrupted schedules, abandoned protocols, and what some officials termed inappropriate emotional displays. "The monarchy has survived for over 1,000 years, the Queen explained carefully, because it has maintained certain standards and boundaries. The people need us to be symbols of stability and dignity, not to become personally involved in their individual struggles." Kate listened respectfully, but inside she felt a fierce resistance building. Everything she had experienced over the past months had shown her the opposite, that people craved authentic connection and genuine care from those in positions of power. "With respect, Your Majesty," Kate replied quietly, "I believe the people need us to show that we understand their struggles, not stand apart from them. The families I've met haven't asked for distance or ceremony. They've asked to be seen and heard." The Queen's expression remained neutral, but Kate could sense the tension in the room. "There will be a state banquet next week," Her Majesty continued. "The president of a strategically important nation will be our guest. This event must proceed with absolute precision and traditional protocol. I need your assurance that you will conduct yourself according to established procedures." Kate nodded her agreement, but her mind was already racing. The state banquet would be attended by dignitaries, politicians, and carefully selected members of the public who had been chosen to represent various achievements and contributions to society. It was exactly the kind of formal, structured event that her new approach had moved away from, as Kate prepared for the banquet over the following days. She found herself in an unexpected internal battle. Part of her wanted to prove that she could still fulfill the traditional requirements of her role, but another part worried about returning to the artificial distance that had once defined royal interactions. The evening of the banquet arrived, with all the pageantry and precision that centuries of tradition demanded. Kate wore a stunning emerald green gown, her hair perfectly styled, every detail of her appearance calculated to project royal elegance. The ballroom at Buckingham Palace gleamed with crystal chandeliers and gold fixtures, creating an atmosphere of otherworldly grandeur. As the receiving line formed, Kate took her designated position beside William, preparing to greet hundreds of guests with the brief, polite exchanges that protocol required. The first few interactions proceeded exactly as planned: warm smiles, gracious thank yous, and carefully timed conversations that allowed the line to move efficiently. But then Kate noticed something that made her pause. Among the invited guests was James Morrison, a veteran she had met months earlier during a visit to a military rehabilitation center. James had lost both legs in Afghanistan and had been struggling with depression and survivor's guilt when they first spoke. At that time, he had been barely able to make eye contact or speak above a whisper. Now, standing in the formal receiving line, wearing his dress uniform and prosthetic legs, James looked transformed. But as he approached Kate, she could see the familiar signs of anxiety in his eyes. The formal setting, the cameras, the pressure of the moment, it was clearly overwhelming him despite his brave exterior. According to protocol, Kate should have offered a brief greeting, thanked him for his service, and moved on to the next guest. The schedule was carefully timed, and any deviation would create a backup that could affect the entire evening. But as James stepped forward, and she saw his hands trembling slightly, Kate made a choice that would be remembered forever. Instead of the standard handshake, Kate stepped forward and placed her hand gently on James's arm. "James," she said softly, "I'm so glad you're here. How are you really doing?" The question was simple, but its impact was immediate. James's formal composure crumbled slightly, and he began to speak honestly about his ongoing struggles and small victories. Kate listened intently, seemingly oblivious to the growing line of guests behind him and the increasingly frantic signals from palace staff. "I've been thinking about what you said," James continued, his voice growing stronger, "about finding purpose and helping other veterans. I've started a support group at the center. We meet twice a week now." Kate's face lit up with genuine joy at this news. "It's wonderful, James. Tell me about it. What's working? What do you need?" As their conversation continued, something remarkable began to happen. Other guests in line, rather than becoming impatient, started to lean in and listen. The formal atmosphere began to shift as people realized they were witnessing something authentic and meaningful. Dr. Sarah Chen, a cancer researcher who was next in line, found herself moved by James's story about helping fellow veterans. When her turn came to meet Kate, instead of the brief exchange she had expected, she found herself discussing the emotional support needs of cancer patients and their families. Kate connected her conversation with Dr. Chen back to James's work, suggesting ways that their different approaches to helping people through trauma might inform each other. The receiving line should have taken exactly 45 minutes, stretched into nearly 2 hours. But something magical was happening in that grand ballroom. Instead of the typical formal mingling where guests made polite small talk while waiting for dinner, genuine conversations were breaking out across the room. Kate moved through these conversations like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of human connection. She introduced the veteran struggling with PTSD to the therapist researching trauma treatment. She connected the teacher working in underserved communities with the businessman looking for meaningful ways to contribute to education. Reform. She facilitated conversations between people who would never have met otherwise, but who had profound experiences and insights to share with each other. The foreign dignitaries and government officials watched in amazement as the formal state banquet transformed into something that resembled a community gathering, more than a royal ceremony. But rather than being offended by the deviation from protocol, many of them seemed energized by the authentic exchanges taking place around them. The president's wife, initially reserved and formal in her interactions, found herself deep in conversation with a social worker from Manchester about innovative approaches to supporting refugees. The president himself was fascinated by a discussion with several veterans about resilience and leadership under extreme pressure. Palace staff watched nervously from the sidelines, unsure whether to intervene or allow the unprecedented evening to continue unfolding. The Queen, observing from across the room, maintained her composed expression. But those who knew her best could see that she was carefully studying every interaction, every response, every moment of genuine connection that Kate was facilitating as. The evening progressed toward the formal dinner. It became clear that something fundamental had shifted. The usual boundaries between royalty and subjects, between officials and citizens, between different social classes and backgrounds, had dissolved into something much more human and meaningful. Kate realized that she had reached a point of no return. She could no longer pretend that formal protocol was more important than authentic human connection. The question now was whether the institution she served could adapt to accommodate this new understanding, or whether her approach would be seen as too disruptive to the established order. The morning after the state banquet brought a flurry of unprecedented media coverage. Photos and videos from the evening showed Kate in deep conversation with guests, facilitating connections and creating an atmosphere that royal commentators struggled to categorize. Headlines ranged from a new era of royal engagement to Princess Catherine rewrites royal protocol. But it was the personal responses that truly revealed the impact of what had occurred. James Morrison, the veteran Kate had spoken with so authentically, posted a video on social media that went viral within hours. With tears in his eyes, he described how Kate's genuine interest in his work had given him the confidence to expand his support group and reach out to veterans across the country. Dr. Sarah Chen, cancer researcher, had connected with 3 other guests that evening and was already planning collaborative research projects that could revolutionize patient care. The social worker from Manchester had received offers of support from multiple attendees who wanted to contribute to refugee assistance programs. The ripple effects of that single evening were spreading in ways that traditional royal events never achieved. But Kate knew that the real test was yet to come. She had been summoned to another meeting with the Queen, and this time, she suspected the conversation would be far more direct. The Queen received her in the same private sitting room where their previous conversation had taken place. But this time, Her Majesty was not alone. Prince Philip sat nearby, his sharp eyes studying Kate with an expression that was difficult to read. Several senior courtiers stood at attention, their faces grave. "Catherine," the Queen began, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of royal tradition, "last evening's events have generated considerable discussion. While the media response has been largely positive, there are serious concerns about the precedent you have set." Kate nodded respectfully, but she could feel her resolve strengthening rather than weakening. The letters and messages she had received since the banquet had shown her the profound hunger that existed for authentic leadership and genuine human connection. Lord Chamberlain stepped forward with a formal document. "Your Royal Highness, we have prepared revised protocols for all future engagements. These guidelines will ensure that such variations from established procedure do not occur again." Kate accepted the document, but didn't open it. Instead, she looked directly at the Queen. "Your Majesty, may I speak freely?" The Queen nodded, and Kate took a deep breath before continuing. I understand the concerns about maintaining tradition and dignity, but I've seen something over these past months that I cannot ignore. The people we serve are struggling with loneliness, with feeling unheard and invisible. When we maintain distance from their struggles, we may preserve our image, but we fail. In our fundamental duty to serve, Prince Philip, who had remained silent, suddenly spoke up. "Young lady, the monarchy has survived wars, scandals, and social upheavals by maintaining its stability and dignity. What you're proposing sounds dangerously close to abandoning the very foundations that make us effective." Kate turned to face him directly, her respect evident, but her conviction unwavering. "Sir, with the greatest respect, I'm not proposing that we abandon our foundations. I'm suggesting that we remember what those foundations were meant to serve. The monarchy exists to serve the people, not to be admired from a distance." The room fell silent as the implications of her words settled over everyone present.
Kate
Was not just defending her actions. She was articulating a fundamental philosophy about the purpose and function of the royal family in modern society. The Queen studied Kate for a long moment before speaking. "What you're describing would require unprecedented changes to protocols that have served us for generations. The risks are considerable." "The risks of continuing as we have are also considerable," Kate replied quietly. "Every family I've met, every person I've spoken with authentically, has shown me that people are hungry for leaders who truly see and understand them. If we don't provide that connection, they'll find it elsewhere, and the monarchy will become irrelevant." What happened next surprised everyone in the room. The Queen rose from her chair and walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens. For several minutes, she stood in contemplative silence while everyone waited for her response. Finally, she turned back to face the group. "Catherine, you will have 1 month to demonstrate that your approach can work within the constraints of our constitutional responsibilities. If you can show that authentic engagement can coexist with royal duty and actually strengthen the monarchy's role, then we will consider broader changes to how we operate." The challenge was both an opportunity and a test that Kate knew would determine the future of her role within the royal family. Over the following days, she worked closely with a small team of progressive palace staff to design a series of engagements that would showcase her approach while meeting all necessary security and constitutional requirements. Her first major test came with a visit to a hospice in Yorkshire, where she would meet with patients facing terminal diagnoses and their families dealing with impending loss. The visit was scheduled to include the standard elements: tours of facilities, meeting with medical staff, and brief interactions with selected patients. But Kate had a different vision for the day. She arrived early and asked to spend time with the overnight staff who provided care during the most difficult hours. She sat with night shift nurses as they described the profound privilege and pain of being present with people during their final days. When she entered the patient areas, Kate's approach was immediately different from any previous royal visit. Instead of moving through the rooms with an entourage, she asked to spend extended time with individual patients and families who were open to longer conversations. In one room, she met Margaret, an 80-year-old former teacher who was surrounded by decades of letters from students whose lives she had touched. Margaret was weak from her illness, but her eyes sparkled as she talked about the young minds she had helped shape over her career. Kate pulled up a chair next to Margaret's bed and asked to hear stories about her favorite students. For the next hour, Margaret shared tales of children who had overcome challenges, students who had discovered hidden talents, and graduates who had returned years later to thank her for believing in them. But it was when Margaret's daughter arrived that the conversation took on deeper meaning. Jennifer had been struggling with guilt about not being able to care for her mother at home, carrying the weight of a decision that had torn her apart for months. Kate listened as Jennifer described the impossible choice between her mother's need for professional medical care and her own desire to provide personal, loving attention during Margaret's final weeks. The young woman's voice broke as she admitted, feeling like she had abandoned the person who had sacrificed everything to raise her. Margaret reached out weakly to take her daughter's hand. "You haven't abandoned me," she whispered. "You've given me the gift of professional care so you can focus on just being my daughter, not my caregiver." Kate watched this tender exchange and realized she was witnessing something sacred. The formal boundaries of her royal role seemed not just inappropriate, but almost offensive in the face of such raw human emotion and love. "Jennifer," Kate said, "gently may I ask what's been the hardest part of this journey for you?" The question opened floodgates of emotion that Jennifer had been holding back for months. She talked about the sleepless nights spent researching treatments, the financial stress of medical bills, the isolation of watching friends drift away because they didn't know how to handle her mother's illness. As Jennifer spoke, other family members in nearby rooms began to gather. Word had spread that the Princess of Wales was having real conversations, not just making ceremonial appearances. Soon, Kate found herself at the center of an impromptu support group for families facing terminal diagnoses. Each story was different, but the themes were heartbreakingly similar. Adult children struggling with role reversals as they became caregivers for parents who had once cared for them. Spouses learning to say goodbye to partners they had planned to grow old with. Parents facing the impossible task of preparing their children for a future they wouldn't be part of. Kate listened to every story with complete attention, asking thoughtful questions and offering the kind of presence that allowed people to feel truly heard. But more importantly, she helped facilitate connections between families who were facing similar challenges. She introduced Jennifer to Mark, whose father was also in the hospice's care, and watched as they immediately began sharing practical advice about navigating medical decisions and managing caregiver stress. She connected Sarah, who was preparing her young children for her husband's death, with Patricia, who had successfully helped her teenagers cope with similar loss the previous year. Dr. Williams, the hospice director, had been observing Kate's interactions throughout the day. He had hosted numerous high-profile visitors over his career, but he had never witnessed anything like what was happening in his facility. "She's not just visiting the dying," he murmured to his colleague. "She's helping create a community of healing for the living." The impact of Kate's approach rippled through the entire hospice. Staff members began to see their work differently, recognizing that they were not just providing medical care, but facilitating profound human connections during the most vulnerable moments of life. Patients who had been withdrawn and isolated began to emerge from their rooms, drawn by the sounds of genuine conversation and laughter. Family members who had been suffering in silence found others who understood their struggles and could offer both practical support and emotional understanding. As the day drew to a close, Kate realized that something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of service. The traditional model of royal visits, brief, formal, carefully controlled, seemed designed to protect the royal family from the messy realities of human suffering. But it was precisely in those messy, authentic moments that real healing and connection occurred. Margaret asked to speak with Kate privately before she left. The elderly woman's voice was weak, but her words carried profound weight. "Thank you," she whispered, "for helping my daughter realize she's not alone. That gift is worth more than any medal or honor you could receive." As Kate prepared to leave the hospice, she was approached by Dr. Williams. "Your Royal Highness, what happened here today? It's changed how we think about our work. Would you consider returning, not for another official visit, but as a regular volunteer?" The suggestion was unprecedented. Members of the royal family didn't volunteer at local facilities like ordinary citizens. But Kate found herself nodding without hesitation. "I would be honored," she replied. That evening, Kate called William to share what she had experienced. "I think I finally understand what we're meant to do," she said. "We're not meant to be symbols that people admire from a distance. We're meant to be bridges that help people connect with each other and find strength they didn't know they had." As she reflected on the day, Kate realized that her month-long test from the Queen had become something much more significant. She wasn't just proving that authentic engagement could work within royal duties. She was discovering a calling that would redefine what those duties actually meant. The letters and messages that arrived over the following days confirmed what Kate already knew. People were hungry for leaders who showed up authentically, weren't afraid to witness their struggles, who could help them find connection and meaning in the midst of difficulty. But Kate also understood that the most challenging part of her journey was still ahead. The real test wouldn't be whether she could connect with individuals in crisis, it would be whether she could maintain that authenticity when facing the ultimate symbol of royal tradition and protocol,